Long before the roar of the crowd echoed through the forum, before his name stirred fear in senators' hearts and hope in the poor, Tiberius Gracchus was only a child walking the stony paths of the Aventine Hill, watching the Republic with the eyes of both privilege and sorrow. He was born into greatness, his father a revered consul and censor, his mother Cornelia, the daughter of Scipio Africanus himself. But though he drank from silver cups and learned Greek from the finest tutors, young Tiberius did not grow up blind. At night, from his family's domus, he could hear the groans of veterans who returned from Rome's endless wars with broken limbs and empty hands. He heard the carts of grain rumbling through the streets, not bound for the poor, but for the estates of senators grown fat on war and land theft. The Republic had triumphed in Carthage, in Macedon, in the east. But its heart was failing. While Rome's legions conquered the world, Rome itself was conquered from within. The backbone of its might, the smallholder farmer, the citizen soldier, had been broken by greed. Noble families seized abandoned lands and worked them with slaves instead of Romans. Thousands of veterans, displaced by war and debt, poured into the capital, rootless, bitter, idle. And into this growing chasm stepped Tiberius. As a young man, he saw the broken soul of the Republic while serving as a military tribune in Numantia. There, he witnessed a scandal, a Roman army, starving and desperate, abandoned by the Senate, forced into surrender. Tiberius negotiated their survival, and was repaid with shame and political suspicion. He returned to Rome not as a hero, but as a man awakened. The corruption was not distant. It sat in marble chairs beneath red togas. The Senate did not protect the Republic. It devoured it. The people remembered his name. By the time he stood for tribune in 133 BCE, Tiberius had become a figure of both promise and peril. Young, eloquent, bearing the noble gravitas of his house and the fiery eyes of a reformer, he was no mere politician, he was an omen. And when he spoke before the people, it was not of conquest, but of land. Of justice. Of a return to the old ways, when a Roman farmed his own soil, fought for his home, and dined with dignity. His proposal was simple: enforce the ancient law that limited the amount of public land any man could own, the lex agraria. Return the rest to those who had none. But in that simplicity lay a blade aimed at the heart of the Senate. As the crowds listened, hearts swelling with hope, in the shadowed porticos of the Curia, the old men stirred uneasily. They knew what such talk had meant in the past. They remembered the fate of those who challenged privilege. Tiberius Gracchus had sown his seed. And soon, blood would water it. When Tiberius Gracchus first ascended the steps of the rostra as tribune, Rome was split not by swords, but by silence. The kind of silence that sits like fog between classes. The patricians dined behind marble, while the plebeians begged for crusts at temples once built in their name. It was not only land that had been stolen, it was voice, dignity, belonging. He had not come to deliver speeches. He had come to disturb the peace that protected injustice. His first act was bold, almost theatrical. He revived the ancient Lex Licinia Sextia, a law ignored for centuries, which limited the amount of public land, ager publicus, any one man could legally possess. But he was no legalist. He introduced a new commission to enforce it, a triumvirate to redistribute excess land to the poor, small plots, enough for a man to work with dignity. And to the surprise of many, he named himself, his younger brother Gaius, and his father-in-law Appius Claudius to oversee it. The Senate reacted not with outrage, but with condescension. A patrician playing tribune was a game they had seen before. But they misread the air. Tiberius was not speaking to them, he was speaking to the people. His words, laced with passion and sorrow, spread like wildfire through the Subura, up the Esquiline, down into the muddy lanes of the Aventine. Veterans, laborers, dispossessed sons of Rome, they heard his promise like a trumpet. The Senate's unease turned to panic. And so they did what Rome's elite always did when cornered, they found a scapegoat. In this case, a fellow tribune named Marcus Octavius. A man of noble birth, Octavius vetoed Tiberius's law, not out of principle, but out of allegiance to those whose estates he was protecting. Tiberius, in a moment that shocked even his allies, responded with the unthinkable. He proposed the removal of Octavius from office, a move without precedent, and to many, an affront to the sanctity of the Tribunatia Potestas itself. But Tiberius did not blink. If one tribune uses his power to destroy the people, he said, then the people must destroy his power. On the day of the vote, the forum was a boiling sea. Shields of rhetoric shattered against walls of fear. When the people raised their hands to depose Octavius, they raised more than votes, they raised history. Octavius was removed. The law passed. And the land began to move. Surveyors in white marked territory long held by great names. Boundaries once guarded by threats were now drawn by law. Homeless citizens received deeds. In olive groves and abandoned fields, fires were lit again, children ran among the vines, and Rome remembered what it meant to grow something. But the Senate never forgot the insult. They saw not a reformer, but a tyrant in seed. To challenge another tribune, to break the sacred equilibrium, it was not just boldness, it was blasphemy. The land commission continued, but the daggers were already being sharpened in the dark. And Tiberius, for all his brilliance, began to speak with the impatience of prophets. He knew the storm was coming. And still, he walked toward it. The year 133 BCE arrived with omens. A comet was said to streak across the Roman sky, a long white wound slashing the heavens. Priests muttered about divine displeasure. Augurs read the flights of birds with frowns. But the people read the signs differently. The Republic was stirring, and Tiberius Gracchus stood at its center, defiant, luminous, and increasingly alone. Land was being redistributed, yes, slowly, imperfectly, and against constant resistance. But Tiberius understood something deeper, that a system fed by greed would not yield its feast for long. What he proposed next would push even his allies to the edge of fear. Attalus III, king of Pergamon in Asia Minor, had died childless and, to the Senate's astonishment, had bequeathed his kingdom to Rome. It was a gift of immense wealth, gold, grain, land. The Senate, of course, expected to control its administration. But Tiberius proposed something bold, and revolutionary. He claimed the people should receive that wealth. That the money from Pergamon should fund the land reforms, aid the new peasant farmers, and reduce reliance on corrupt tax collectors and elite financiers. He did not consult the Senate. He simply announced it. The Senate was livid. This was no longer about law. It was about power. By bypassing them, Tiberius had touched the sacred nerve of aristocratic Rome, the unwritten rule that even a tribune, however powerful, must kneel, if not in body, then in ritual. Tiberius had knelt to none. His supporters adored him. But others, even those who had once walked beside him, began to whisper. Was this justice, or was it monarchy in new robes? Had he crossed from tribune to demagogue? And then came the most dangerous move of all. His tribunate, by law, was ending. And yet, he sought re-election. To the people, it was necessity. The Senate would undo everything once he stepped down. To the patricians, it was tyranny. No tribune had ever served twice in a row. This, they claimed, was ambition in its most dangerous form, the slow drift from popular hero to king. On the day of the vote, the forum was overflowing. Not with order, but with trembling tension. Armed men lurked at the edges. Murmurs cut through the crowd like blades. Tiberius wore a dark cloak instead of his usual white, a silent signal to those who understood, this was not just a political struggle. It was life and death. When news came that his opponents were plotting to kill him, right there, under the open sky, he raised his hand to his head, a signal to his supporters that many mistook as a plea for a crown. That gesture would be remembered not as a warning, but as a death sentence. Senators, led by Scipio Nazica, stormed the assembly with clubs and shattered table legs. No swords, to avoid defiling the sacred ground with blood. But it made no difference. Tiberius was bludgeoned to death beside the very rostra from which he had once spoken of justice. 300 of his followers were killed that day. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber. Unburied. Forgotten by the state they had tried to save. The Forum was silent. Where once the voice of Tiberius stirred crowds to fire and purpose, now there was only the rustle of wind through fallen togas and scattered sandals. The stones bore no memory, but the people did. Rome had committed a murder in daylight. Not a quiet assassination in alley shadows, but a killing on sacred ground, in front of gods and citizens alike. The corpse of a tribune thrown into the Tiber was more than desecration, it was a signal. The Republic had crossed a line it would never fully uncross. And yet, the land commission remained. Though Tiberius lay dead, the agrarian reforms he set in motion continued, for a time. The triumvirs, Appius Claudius, Gaius Gracchus, and Publius Mucius, still worked the machinery he left behind, dividing land among the poor. But it was a machine now missing its voice, its fire, its shield. The Senate, wary of inflaming the crowd with open defiance, allowed the process to continue, while they waited. It was a dangerous equilibrium, held not by justice, but by fear. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, dressed not in black, but in white. "This is not mourning," she was said to whisper. "This is preparation." She raised her younger son, Gaius, not in the shadow of loss, but in the iron of remembrance. If Tiberius had died standing, Gaius would learn to walk with silence and strike when needed. But the city was changing. More than land had shifted, minds had, too. The plebeians had watched as their hero bled in the heart of Rome, and something ancient and binding began to fray. If a tribune could be slain without trial, what protection remained for anyone? If the Senate could do this, what else could it justify? The Optimates, Rome's aristocratic elite, hardened. Their argument was simple: Tiberius had sought power beyond his right. He had courted the mob. He had threatened the balance. In killing him, they had saved the Republic. But the people heard something different. They heard the Senate say, "We rule. You do not." And behind closed doors, the elite did what they always did, they rewrote memory. They called Tiberius a tyrant. They compared him to the kings Rome had long since cast off. In sculptures, his likeness was erased. In records, his name was shortened or omitted. But history has a way of resisting silence. His followers, many of whom had seen their lives transformed by land reform, began to whisper again. In taverns. In bathhouses. In markets. The whispers grew, and they carried a name. Gaius. He was younger, more measured, more calculating. But he was his brother's blood. And though he remained quiet in the months after Tiberius's death, he watched everything. He studied the mistakes. He saw how Tiberius had risen too quickly, struck too boldly, and underestimated how far the Senate would go to keep power. Gaius would not make the same mistakes. He would take Rome by storm, but only once he had learned to walk in shadow. When Gaius Gracchus returned to the public eye, it was not with the thunderclap of his brother's speeches, but with the silence of patience honed into steel. Years had passed since Tiberius's murder. The land reform had stalled. The Senate's grip had tightened again. Rome had returned to its old rhythm, outwardly stable, inwardly seething. But Gaius had not been idle. He served in Sardinia as quaestor, earning praise for discipline, integrity, and administration. He refused bribes, supported allies among the poor, and kept his distance from the political stage. But when he returned to Rome, the wind changed. He was older now, sharpened. And the name Gracchus, once a whisper of danger, had become a cry of unfinished justice. In 123 BCE, Gaius stood for the tribunate. This time, the people were ready. He won by landslide. But Gaius was not Tiberius. Where his brother had struck like a sword, Gaius built like an architect. He introduced wave after wave of reform, not one law, but a system. He redistributed grain to the poor at subsidized prices. He renewed and expanded the land commissions. He strengthened the rights of allies. He restructured military service to protect the dignity of soldiers. And he targeted the Senate, not with violence, but with bureaucracy. He proposed that equestrians, wealthy non-senators, should serve as jurors in corruption courts. It was a masterstroke. He divided the elite, weakening the Senate by empowering their economic rivals. He reshaped the Roman legal system from within. Crowds adored him. His oratory was legendary, not just persuasive, but rhythmic, poetic, magnetic. He stood in the forum not as a man demanding power, but as one summoning a different Rome into being. The Senate called him dangerous. The people called him a savior. And then, he did what few expected. He ran for a second term, and won. Unlike Tiberius, Gaius had the momentum, the structure, and the popularity to carry him. He was not merely repeating history, he was rewriting it. But greatness is never without shadow. The Senate, cowed but not defeated, watched closely. They saw the laws pile up. They saw the people emboldened. They saw the republic shifting beneath their feet, and they began to plan. A tribune named Livius Drusus was raised as a counterweight, charming, moderate, gifted in flattery. He proposed similar reforms, but gentler, quieter, shaped to suit the crowd while preserving the old order. Some of Gaius's supporters wavered. Then came a decision that broke the spell. Gaius supported the founding of a Roman colony on the site of ancient Carthage, a symbolic act of defiance, planting Roman citizens where Scipio had once salted the earth. The conservatives were horrified. Carthage was cursed, they said. The gods would punish such pride. The people, once united, began to murmur. And the Senate seized the moment. At a public assembly, a scuffle broke out. One of Gaius's supporters struck down an attendant of the consul. The Senate now had their excuse. They invoked the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree, let the consuls see to it that the republic takes no harm. It was a declaration of war. The day the republic turned its blade inward once more began not with trumpets but with dread. Gaius Gracchus awoke to the sounds of boots. Not legions, not yet, but civic guards, hired thugs, loyalists. Rome's streets were thick with tension. The Senate had declared a Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree. The veil of legality remained, but all restraint had been cast into the Tiber. Gaius, warned by loyal allies, fled the Forum for the Aventine Hill, a sacred place of plebeian memory, where Rome's early people once made their stand against kings. Now, the last tribune of the people stood there again, not with swords, but with silence. His friend, Fulvius Flaccus, urged resistance. Call the people. Raise the banners. We are still Rome. But Gaius refused civil war. He would not bathe his brother's dream in fratricidal blood. Yet the Senate did not come to negotiate. The consul Lucius Opimius arrived with soldiers, archers, and the Senate's blessing to do what must be done. They offered false parley. When Flaccus stepped forward with his son to speak, they were slaughtered without hesitation. The blood had begun to flow again. Gaius ran, not in cowardice, but to prevent more killing. With only a single loyal servant, Philocrates, he made his way through the twisting alleys of the Aventine Gardens. He paused once near a temple, looking back at the city rising behind him, at the columns, the stone, the vision his family had tried to redeem. There, he made a final choice. He would not let the Senate make a spectacle of his death. He asked Philocrates to do what he could not. And with a blade of iron and trembling hands, the last light of the Gracchi was extinguished. Philocrates took his own life shortly after. The Senate placed a bounty on Gaius's head. His murderers, believing in spectacle, decapitated his body and filled his skull with molten lead to ensure its weight met the promised reward. Over 3,000 of his supporters were executed without trial. Their homes were razed. their names stricken. And yet, the land laws of the Gracchi were not undone. The reforms remained. Watered in blood, rooted in courage, they endured. Others would later dismantle them, distort them, but for a time, the common man of Rome stood taller, held land, bore dignity. Because two brothers dared to speak against centuries of silence. Cornelia, upon hearing of Gaius's death, refused to mourn in public. "I bore 2 sons," she said, "and both died for Rome. I count myself most blessed." The Republic had killed its conscience, and crowned itself in law. But it had birthed something else. A memory. A precedent. A fire. And across centuries, in cities born long after Rome's fall, that fire would be called by many names: liberty, justice, resistance. After the blood dried on the stones of the Aventine, Rome exhaled, not in peace, but in weariness. The Senate resumed its banquets. The Forum echoed once again with merchant cries and political speeches. But beneath the surface, something had changed. Rome had not healed. It had hardened. The Gracchi were gone, but they had cracked the facade of the Republic. No longer could the Senate pretend that all men had equal voice. No longer could reform be merely debated, it now lived in memory, in bones buried beneath the city's marble. It haunted every law passed, every tribune who dared rise. Cornelia retreated to her villa in Misenum. There, she became something greater than a mother of martyrs, she became a symbol. Philosophers, young reformers, and future rebels came to sit at her feet. She spoke not with vengeance, but with clarity. My sons were not kings. They sought no throne. They remembered the people. And the Senate killed them for it. The Senate, in response, tried to erase the very language of the Gracchi. But language is slippery. Even in silence, it endures. Young men, not yet born when Tiberius stood at the rostra, began asking dangerous questions. What if the Republic was broken? What if the mos maiorum, the sacred way of the ancestors, had become a shield for greed? What if the people needed not just tribunes, but champions? One of those youths was a boy named Marius. Another was a child called Sulla. And farther still, in a patrician household near the Palatine Hill, a clever boy named Gaius Julius Caesar listened to his tutors describe the fall of Carthage and the death of the Gracchi, and said nothing. But his eyes, even then, burned with comprehension. Rome would never be the same. The Republic, though it stood, had felt the shudder of its own hypocrisy. The seed of civil strife had been planted. The old gods, so long invoked in the Senate service, now watched in silence. Soon, Rome's greatest men would no longer debate policy in togas. They would wear armor. And yet, even as the storm gathered on distant horizons, the name Gracchus lingered in the wind. Not as a curse. As a question. What does justice cost? And who dares to pay it? The shadow of the Gracchi fell long across the Senate floor, though none dared speak it aloud. After Gaius's death, the Republic tried to compose itself like a man brushing blood from a tunic, adjusting to forget the stain. But no amount of decorum could reverse what had begun. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the optimates, the senatorial conservatives, had won. Their enemies lay buried, their reforms slowed, their prestige reaffirmed. The consul Opimius, who had ordered the death of Gaius, even built a temple to Concord on the very site where Roman citizens had been slaughtered. A marble edifice to unity, raised over corpses. But concord cannot be carved from contradiction. The plebeians saw the temple not as reconciliation, but as mockery. They whispered that the gods themselves would not dwell where injustice reigned. Rome had become a place where killing a tribune, once unthinkable, was now precedent. And precedent is power's sharpest tool. Soon, violence seeped into the marrow of politics. Where once the Senate chamber held debate, it now held threats. Senators brought armed escorts to meetings. Elections were no longer contests of vision, but of intimidation. The rostra echoed with rhetoric, but also with the sound of clubs. The Republic had become a theater where old rituals played out atop a crumbling foundation. And yet, amid the rising tension, another transformation unfolded. The plebs had begun to remember their strength. The legacy of the Gracchi became something more than mourning, it became instruction. Their reforms, though battered, had taught a generation how to challenge power. Their fall had taught what the Senate feared most, the people's awakening. The name Gracchus was no longer just a family line. It was an idea. The Republic now existed in dual form. One Rome clung to tradition, gilded with titles, hollowed by wealth. The other simmered with memory, anger, and a hunger for justice. A line had been drawn, not by law, but by history. It would not fade. In the taverns, stories of the Gracchi were told like sacred myths. Tiberius, the first spark. Gaius, the silent storm. Their deaths, no longer signs of defeat, were seen as sacrifices. They had dared to demand that Rome live up to its promise. And for that, they had died. But Rome had listened, even if it claimed not to. For in every policy that followed, in every new tribune who raised his voice, in every senator who looked over his shoulder, the question lingered. What if they had lived? Rome moved forward as it always did, brick by brick, decree by decree, pretending it had not fractured. The Senate passed laws. Consuls marched to foreign wars. Triumphs were held. But beneath the marble and spectacle, something deep and irreversible had shifted. The Republic was no longer a house of unity. It had become a battlefield of classes, veiled in rhetoric and polished tradition. The Senate, though still adorned with dignity, was rotting from within, cliques, bribes, inheritance politics. And on the streets, the plebeians grew bolder, hungrier, angrier. The legacy of the Gracchi whispered to all sides. The populace, those who claimed to serve the people, adopted the language of reform. Men like Saturninus and Glaucia would later stir the crowd with words once spoken by Tiberius and Gaius: land, grain, dignity. But these were not Gracchi reborn. They wielded reform as a weapon, not a calling. The optimates, the senatorial conservatives, responded with sharpened claws. Every proposal, no matter how just, was branded sedition. Every cry for equity, a step toward monarchy. And when the Senate could not stop dissent with law, it stopped it with violence. Politics became war by other means. And the Republic, once proud of its balance, the harmony between patrician and plebeian, between Senate and Tribune, had become a tightrope above chaos. Every election carried the scent of blood. Every alliance cracked from within. And then came men who remembered the Gracchi differently. Marius, the new man, rose from outside the old nobility. He reformed the army, offering land and citizenship to those who served, binding loyalty not to Rome, but to himself. He was not a Gracchus, but he understood what they had tapped into, the deep hunger for inclusion. And Sulla, the patrician born to avenge tradition, saw what came of tribunes who reached too far. He vowed to get the office of tribune, to make sure no man would ever again challenge the Senate from below. They both bathed Rome in civil war. And still, the name Gracchus lingered. For in every argument over the Republic's soul, their ghosts were present. Not only because of what they had done, but because of how Rome had killed them. The tribunes were no longer sacred. The law no longer shielded the people. What remained was ambition, sharpened by memory. The Republic would fall, not because of the Gracchi, but because Rome had chosen to murder its conscience instead of listening to it. The age of the Republic neared its twilight, not with sudden collapse, but through erosion, steady, deliberate, and blind to its own unraveling. The warnings of the Gracchi, once dismissed as radical, now rang like prophecy in the ears of those who lived through the century's final decades. Rome had become an empire in all but name, not a republic of laws, but a system ruled by power, coin, and patronage. The Senate, bloated and fractured, no longer commanded respect, only obedience, or resistance. Civil war had replaced dialogue. Legions answered to generals, not the state. And through it all, the words of Tiberius and Gaius echoed like flint struck in a dark cave. Marius had reformed the legions. Sulla had marched on Rome. Blood had soaked the Forum. And yet, each new upheaval traced its roots to the moment when two brothers dared to ask, who does Rome truly belong to? Julius Caesar remembered. As a young man, he had idolized Gaius Gracchus. He studied his speeches, his reforms, his death. He understood not just what Gaius had tried to build, but why the Senate had destroyed him. And he drew a lesson of his own: if the law cannot protect justice, power must. Caesar aligned himself with the populace, but he was no idealist. He used their language with precision, offering bread, games, and debt relief. He was the heir of the people's hunger, and he became their sword. When he crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE, he did not only defy Pompey and the Senate. He defied a system that had murdered Tiberius in cold blood and called it justice. He defied the hypocrisy of Concordia carved in marble over bones. The Republic trembled. But it was not just ambition that brought the Republic to its knees. It was memory. Memory of failure. Of betrayal. Of unhealed wounds. The people remembered the Gracchi not as revolutionaries, but as those who had tried to speak for them, and were struck down by those who claimed to represent law. And so, when Caesar claimed power, many cheered. Not because they wanted a dictator, but because they had already lost faith in the Senate's promises. They had already watched justice die on the rostra. Rome crowned Caesar with laurel. He, too, would fall, stabbed in the Senate like a sacrificial echo. But his rise, his reach, his rhetoric, all of it bore the fingerprints of the Gracchi. The empire to come would wear their shadow. By the time Octavian became Augustus and the curtain of empire fell upon the broken bones of the Republic, the story of the Gracchi had already slipped into myth, and yet it pulsed, silent and stubborn, through every marble colonnade the emperors erected. Augustus, though he spoke of restoring the Republic, ruled with the knowledge that the Senate was now a theater and the people, an audience to be pacified. But behind his carefully staged reforms lay the lessons of history. The fate of Rome was not written in laws, but in loyalty, and memory. He knew the Gracchi had been killed not for treason, but for threatening the comfort of power. So he co-opted their symbols. Grain was distributed. Land was granted to veterans. Public works blossomed. Not because justice prevailed, but because empire had learned to wear justice like a cloak. Augustus did not reform to uplift, he reformed to prevent another spark. The name Gracchus was never outlawed, it was simply left unspoken. And yet, their presence endured like a ghost beneath the stones. Every emperor who came after would walk a narrow path. Some ruled with mercy, others with cruelty, but none could afford to forget what happened when the plebeians believed they had been silenced. The tribunes still existed in name, but their power was ceremonial. The Senate still met, but it obeyed the throne. And beneath it all, the Roman people remembered. In poems, plays, and whispers, the Gracchi returned. Not as failed revolutionaries, but as martyrs of a better Rome that never came. Sculptors began to chisel their faces into monuments again, now safely distant. Historians debated their motives, their methods, their pride, but none could deny the legacy of what they represented. In the eastern provinces, as the empire grew bloated with conquest, new leaders invoked their story. In Africa, Gaul, and even distant Britannia, governors spoke of fairness to the poor, citing the old tribunes of the people. Even if the emperors scoffed, the people listened. Because the dream had not died, only the men who dared to voice it. The Gracchi had become more powerful dead than alive. Not through violence. Not through office. But through memory. Rome would wear the imperial crown for centuries. It would burn, rise again in Byzantium, pass into legend. But the question first raised by Tiberius would echo still. Who defends the poor, when the law is owned by the rich? And the answer, whispered from age to age, would never again belong to the Senate alone. Empires crumble. Stones fade. Names are chiseled down by time. But some voices, those silenced early, continue speaking across centuries. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus never saw the Rome they dreamed of. Their reforms were clipped, their lives taken. And yet, their fire survived the fall of the Republic, outlived the Caesars, and echoed into a world far beyond Roman borders. Their story became more than Roman. It became human. In the Middle Ages, when peasants marched for bread and land, their leaders whispered of ancient tribunes who dared to question kings. During the Enlightenment, as thinkers in salons and studies debated the rights of man, the names of Tiberius and Gaius appeared in treatises beside Plato and Cicero. The balance between wealth and justice, between law and equity, the Gracchi had voiced it long before the world was ready to listen. And when revolution stirred in France, and later across the Atlantic in America, their shadows were there. Not as idols, but as warnings, and as witnesses. That power, unchecked, devours. That institutions, when divorced from people, rot from within. That justice must sometimes be demanded, not requested. In modern cities, where towers replace temples and ballots replace swords, the ghost of the Gracchi still walks. In every movement for land reform. In every law defending workers. In every voice that rises when silence is safer. They speak through every citizen who believes a state must serve not the powerful, but the many. And perhaps that is their truest legacy. Not the fields restored. Not the speeches remembered. But the idea that no system, no senate, no empire, however gilded, should fear the cry of the people it governs. Their dream remains unfinished. But it remains. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of justice, power, and legacy ripple through time, let us know in the comments. Subscribe to the channel for more cinematic stories from history's forgotten hearts. Because some truths deserve to be retold, until the world listens.